We'll get started. Let's also initiate the recording. So welcome Dr. Karthik Raman to the workshop, and of course to the participants. And as you can see, the derivative is actually increasing. It's quite high derivative of participants joining. So as they join, I'll take the pleasure of introducing speaker. The first speaker for the evening. We have with us the pleasure of hosting Professor Karthik Raman, who is an associate professor at the Department of Biotechnology, Bhupat and Jyoti Mehta School of Biosciences at IIT Madras. Karthik's research group works on the development of algorithms and computational tools to understand, predict, and manipulate complex biological networks. Broadly spanning computational aspects of synthetic and systems biology, key areas of research in his group encompass microbiome analysis, in silico metabolic engineering, biological network design, and biological data analysis. Karthik also coordinates the Initiative for Biological Systems Engineering at IIT Madras and is a core member of the Robert Bosch Center for Data Science and Artificial Intelligence. He teaches courses on computational biology and systems biology at IIT Madras and has also authored a textbook on computational systems biology. So we are very happy to have you with us, Karthik, today, and we look forward to an enthralling talk. Thank you, and over the floor to you.
Thank you, Arun. I hope I'm clearly audible. I would like to really thank Sunetra, Arun, and Shayan for putting together this nice workshop, for all the efforts in organizing it. Thank you once again for the opportunity. And I think there has been some representation of biological networks so far, but I'm going to try to take a slightly different angle on it. Typically, and a little different from what I typically present. I typically talk a lot about metabolic networks and things like that, which is one of the main interests in our group. But today I'm going to sort of do justice to the three logos that you see on my first slide. And I'm going to try and talk about something at the intersection of all these three. So there is biology, there is networks, and there is machine learning and artificial intelligence, if you will. So I'm going to talk about some interesting networks in biology and how we can learn from on and using these networks. Using three different examples. I'll go into much greater detail into a module identification aspect of it, but the other ones I'll try to keep it brief. Please, feel free to ask questions in the chat box, and of course I am anticipating that we'll have enough time at the end of the talk for questions. So this is the outline of my talk. I'm going to first talk about graph theory in biology, and then learning on networks, where I'm going to talk about identifying modules in biological networks and how it can be quite challenging. I'll talk to you about a challenge, actually, a competition. And then learning using networks, wherein we use all the network information that is available to us to synthesize some sort of rules that will help us predict reactions and so on. And finally, what is it that we can infer from network structure? So using the topology of networks to infer essential genes and protein-protein interaction networks. So these are three of the subtopics I'm going to focus on today. But given that there are quite a few students in the audience, let me just start with a brief overview of graph theory in biology. I'm sure all of you are very familiar with graph theory and networks, but what is its intersection with biology? And you will see that there are many, many interesting applications in biology. So there are many biological problems that naturally map onto graphs. Something like a pathfinding in metabolic networks problem, which is something I'll talk about today. Predicting protein-protein interactions. This is more of a link prediction problem. Read assembly of genome fragments on a next generation sequencer. You may have all heard about how sequencing costs are going down and how sequencing has become so rapid. And well, we also have a Genome India project wherein we are sequencing 10,000 Indian genomes. So there's a lot of action happening in terms of genome sequencing all over the world. but none of it would be possible if it were not for some graph algorithms. And there is a gradation of interesting graph algorithms that you see in the field. I'm not going to talk about any of these today, but this is just to pique your interest. So you may want to go and read up a little more about it. Today, I'm going to focus a lot more on identifying clusters or modules in large networks. This is basically the classic computer science problem of community detection, but how it becomes a different sort of challenge when it comes to biological networks. Network biology, as you know, the term was sort of coined by Barabashi and Oltvai, I would say, and it has gained widespread popularity. They have a very nice review, which I've listed here. Must read for anybody who's looking to learn a little bit more about biology and networks. This talks about construction and analysis of a wide variety of biological networks. What kind of biological networks we can have? We can have protein interaction networks, metabolic networks. I'll talk about some of them in the next slide. And there are many applications in ML. So you apply ML to these networks for various interesting applications, and that's what I'm going to talk to you about today. But first, what are the different networks we have in biology? There are several different networks. So you have metabolic networks, protein interaction networks, gene regulatory networks. Some of these images you can see by the slide. So this is a classic yeast protein interaction network. You may see this a lot, including in the review that I was talking about, very famous. This is the kind of network. This is again a functional association network of proteins that you would see in a database known as a string. This is a nice representation of a metabolic network. But basically, in all of these, you need to identify what is a node, what is an edge, what kind of interactions are being captured, and so on. So, and whether they are directed or not. So here, I'm sure you can see the tiny arrowheads. So this is a directed network, whereas these are undirected networks. They just capture functional associations or sometimes physical interactions and so on. So you have a variety of these networks. All the first few networks that I talk about are all within a cell. Protein structure networks are a little different. They're very, very interesting. I'm unfortunately not going to talk about them today, but there's a lot of nice, interesting literature on that, where a single protein is actually represented as a network. And what happens to the protein when amino acids change, and what kind of, how does it affect the dynamics of folding? Very interesting questions. And Dr. Adi in our department has worked on some of these too. Cellular function itself is the result of all these underlying networks. And this is something that we try to wrap our heads around. How do we understand cellular function from various perspectives? Can you look at metabolic networks? Can you look at protein interaction networks? And can you start looking at the interplay between these networks as well? So with that, let me go on to the first topic, which is of learning on networks. This is basically module identification or community detection in graphs. It's the classic problem in graph theory. With the classic problem, you should always know about the classic data set. So this is a gold standard for community detection algorithms. It's a paper that was back in 1977. This was a karate club that was being studied as part of a social experiment. And as luck would have it, during the study, the club, there was some fight between some folks in the club, and the club fragmented into two. So there were two factions, and it turns out that community detection algorithms can really nicely capture it. So the basic, simplest sanity check for a community detection algorithm is if it can capture the Zachary's Karate Club data set. And it's a very famous thing. Apparently, there are T-shirts that people wear in conferences which talk about this data set, saying, if you cannot predict on this, you can go home. And but how do you perform community detection or clustering? What are the challenges? There are many algorithms that exist, but can you directly apply them to biological networks? That becomes a question. Because biology is always quirky, and as are biological networks. So what do we mean by communities or clusters or modules? These are, loosely speaking, groups of nodes that are more tightly knit, meaning they have lots more intra-edges and inter-edges between the communities. And there are other applications as well, wherein you can take a complex network like this and sort of simplify it to clusters to make it more tractable and so on. And these are classic network pictures that you will see. This is a co-authorship network, as a citation network. And you'll find that there are papers on statistical physics that cite papers from other fields, and there are some papers on mathematical ecology that cite paper from agent-based models and so on. But typically, there's a lot of clustering. More mathematical ecology papers are going to cite more mathematical ecology papers within the field. So let me get to the challenge that we participated in. This is a very interesting problem that we had to solve. We were given 6 networks. So these had different number of genes, different number of edges, as you can see, and very different lenses through which the cells were studied. So two were protein interaction networks. One was a signaling network. Another one was a simpler co-expression network, wherein 2 genes, whether they were present at the same time in a given cell, or something that was related to cancer dependency or homology. Let's not worry about these networks, but suffices to say, and in fact that was the challenge itself, suffices to say that we got pictures like this, or rather lists. So A connects to B connects to C, and so on. And there were 2 challenges. So one was trying to find modules in a single network, and the other one was to find modules across all of these networks. And there was a ranking, a proper ranking system based on another algorithm, a tool called Pascal, against some kind of data sets. I'll not go into all those details. We can skim over these for the purposes of this talk. What were the challenges? The challenge was, we do not know if it was STAT or IL-17 or JAK. These are names of proteins that people may be familiar with. Anybody who's looked at a biology paper would see all of these acronyms jumping at you. But this is what we got. We got that node 1 connects to node 2, and there is a triangle that's formed between 1, 2, and 3. So we do not know the identity of node 1, except that we do note that across networks, so meaning in network 1 and network 2, node 217 is the same in both networks. It maps to the same protein, but we do not know what protein it is, and so on. But this means that we had no ground truth available to train, and we could only go in for unsupervised clustering. The other challenge was that we had only limited submissions or evaluations, and the evaluation itself was very challenging. It was very time consuming, meaning if we came up with one sort of clustering, to get a score on that locally, and actually local testing was not possible in much of the initial part of the challenge, because we had to submit it through their server where the evaluation would be done. So we were literally, blindfolded and one hand tied, and we had to solve this problem. But the rationale was simple. This gives you a baseline on how well you can perform without any biological information. Because it's obvious that if you start putting biological information, you can do much smarter. But in the absence of all of this, just what does network structure tell you about a biological network? So do existing algorithms work well? Do we have to tweak them? And so on. And they also had a condition on module sizes. They had to be only between 3 and 100. And we had to identify non-overlapping modules. This is a bit of a catch, because in biology, it really doesn't work that way. The same protein could be very well part of multiple modules. So this is a challenge that we had to sort of grapple with. And we also do suggest that it's better to find overlapping modules or overlapping community detection and so on. Main question is, how do we extend classic community detection algorithms to act or to work with biological networks? And the challenge summary is a very nice paper. You can read it if you're interested in community detection, because it talks about 42 single network and 33 multi-network methods contributed by about 400 participants. So it was a massive consortium paper where there were methods that were based on kernel clustering, modularity optimization, which is where some of our methods. So our methods fall in 2 or 3 of these things. Random walk based, local methods, and also ensemble methods. So a huge array of methods were used to tackle this challenge from groups across the world. So what was our approach? We first went about extending classic approaches. We then looked at trying to identify strongly connected core modules. And lastly, we also suggest that overlapping modules make a lot more biological sense in this context. So some basics. What are the baselines available, and what are the measures of community quality? So there is this notion of modularity. So modularity is basically captures when you have a higher than chance of edges within a group compared to a null model. So between a bunch of nodes in a network, you see far more edges than you would expect from a null model. Conductance is another metric which tries to capture the isolation of nodes in a network. There are other metrics that have been developed. This was in fact developed in Professor Ravindran's group, SEAL. It takes a sort of middle ground between modularity, which captures internal density, and conductance, which talks more about the spread and isolation. And there was also methods that are based on random walk, Markov clustering, and so on. There are multiple methods. These are standard methods available in literature. But what we did was we tried to identify small and structurally well-defined communities that were to capture the sort of core of a particular pathway or a particular disease and so on. So the idea was these modules had to be relevant in disease. That was how the evaluation was happening. So we came up with certain approaches to identify small and structurally defined communities. We also looked at ensemble clustering, looking at applying a battery of methods and then building a clustering on top of that. I'll show you how we did that. And another very interesting approach we took was based on perturbation to identify persistent communities. So you take a community and you randomly throw away some fraction of its edges, like say 1% of its edges. And you have a remaining community. Now you look at the clustering in this community and you rinse and repeat this multiple times. So once you do this multiple times, you get multiple clusterings. So this becomes an ensemble. And can you look across this ensemble to see what nodes are more often in the same cluster and so on. So these are more tighter and core communities. And we also did a simple multiple core identification by taking up a large community and fragmenting it. So again, your classic algorithms often return largish communities. Can you take them and again sort of decompose them into smaller, stronger, tightly knit communities? Now, ensemble clustering basically works like this. So we have different nodes and their memberships given by different algorithms. So this is then we compute a sort of similarity between for a given node. What is the similarity of its between a pair of nodes? So for the same node, it's going to be the same. It's going to be unity. But then here, 2 out of 3 are the same. In 2 out of the 3 algorithms, they belong in the same cluster. Here 1 and A, but here it's an X and Z. Essentially use this and then use a bunch of other methods to cluster the network. And finally, again, apply the same classic algorithm of modularity maximization on this network. So you can say that this is an adjacency matrix and you can synthesize a network out of this. So this was we had some original networks. We ran it through algorithms to get some communities. Once we got these communities, based on the communities, we computed a similarity again between the networks and again ran a community detection. Right? So slightly roundabout, but this gave us very interesting results. And this was the perturbation that I was talking about. So you randomly drop 1% of the edges and generate multiple networks. And you repeat this about 100 times. And then you look at core modules that are generated based on consensus from this. So the same idea was used. You come up with different community assignments and you look at the similarity between 2 nodes based on how often they are present in the same community. So if these 2 nodes are present in the same community in this iteration and this iteration and multiple iterations, it increases the likelihood of them having a strong edge in the final community, and they are possibly part of the same core community. We again did modularity maximization to this because that's a classic algorithm which works very well in practice. So the next thing was if you remember the challenge conditions, we had to identify networks that had between 3 and 100 nodes in each module. So sometimes you get very large modules that are identified. So we came up with an approach to prune these. So we took a large module and looked at a core based on certain metrics in terms of what were the number of outgoing edges if you were to draw a community here and so on. And we had a core score which talks about what are the number of outgoing edges versus internal edges in a community. And we basically tried to, we came up with a heuristic that's based on our some experience with these different kinds of data sets. That we said that we will try to keep the average size down to about 60. 3 to 100 was the challenge criterion, but we basically said that we will keep it around 60. And I think this was the final scoring. And there are baselines here, and there are core module based methods here, and then this is the diffusion state distance. So these are all R methods, and these are the baseline methods, and this was the winning method. And if you see that R methods have a much better hit ratio in terms of, for example, we predict fewer modules, but more of these modules are actually enriched. Whereas you see that this diffusion state distance predicts 1020 modules, out of which 24 were enriched. So we had 22 modules which were good according to the final evaluation amongst only 462 modules that were predicted. You still see that there is a lot of, so here one should not look at the denominator as such, but the challenge itself was evaluated based on simply the numerator. But I think the ratio also has some interesting story to tell, which is what I'm trying to say here. So if you see, the hit ratio of our algorithm was quite high in basically all of the, most of the scenarios for each of these networks. So these were the 6 networks that we studied. So this was basically the, the first study that I wanted to talk to you about. So we participated in this challenge where we had 6 different kinds of networks, and with very little information. We had no biological information to go with. We had just pure network information. And based on this, we had to actually identify all the modules and also see if these modules can be identified across networks and so on. So in the first part of the challenge, we use a single network information to derive modules. But all the methods that were in the study, the 75 methods that were discussed in this paper, they mostly found that the multi-network methods weren't too helpful. So somehow, probably there is more confounding that happens across data sets than a synthesis or integration of information. So this was one interesting challenge. So with that, let me switch gears and go to the next topic, which is again, can be a very fascinating topic and a fascinating question, especially in the context of modern drug discovery and things like that. In this study, we try to predict metabolic pathways using this notion of subgraph mining. So what do we do here? This is a classic question that many of you may have seen in school or in a JEE exam. You have a molecule on the left-hand side, and you have a molecule on the right-hand side, and you need to come up with a bunch of reactions, typically organic chemistry reactions, that would convert this molecule to this molecule. You typically say that this will be a Diels-Alder reaction or something. So you have some memory of your organic chemistry reactions, and you then try to mix and match them in your head and assemble them to build 2 or 3 steps, typically not much longer in an exam, maybe just 1 step even, to convert a molecule like this to a molecule like this. But can we do better than that today? Can we use the wealth of knowledge that is accumulated from databases? So to answer this question, there are about 10,000 plus reactions, and today probably even more, maybe 20,000 reactions that are available in databases such as the KEGG, Biopsych, and so on, which basically capture a large part of biochemistry space and the biochemical synthesis potential of nature, essentially. There's so many different organisms with so many conserved metabolic pathways. So between 2 organisms, you have a lot of similarities, and you also have some novel differences and so on. And there are these very interesting organisms that are present in unusual environments, like hot water springs or in deep sea hydrothermal vents and things like that. And these have some really quirky metabolisms, very unusual chemistries and so on. And can you use all of that to basically synthesize, let's say, a vitamin through a biological process than through a chemical process, which is potentially less green has more purification steps involved. And well, certainly if you're trying to synthesize an optically pure molecule, you're much better off trying to do a biological process than a chemical process. So there are multiple reasons why somebody would like to go in for a chemical process, a biochemical process than a chemical process. But how do you actually achieve this? Is this easy? Can you really predict this easily? And well, this is at the heart of metabolic engineering, essentially copy pasting these reactions from one organism into another. In fact, there is a very famous success story of synthetic biology in this fashion. There is this drug called artemisinic acid. Yes, there's artemisinin and artemisinic acid. I think artemisinin is the drug. Artemisinic acid is the precursor. With a lot of novel metabolic engineering, there are scientists who stuck a pathway into E. coli, debugged it, optimized it, and then put it into yeast so that they could produce this really expensive drug. In fact, the precursor for this expensive drug. And then one simple step of chemical synthesis, and artemisinic acid is converted to artemisinin through a chemical step. And these kinds of pathways can really, or when they are put into smaller organisms, can really simplify or make increase the accessibility of rare and expensive drugs to the general public. So these are very socially important as well. And this is known as retrosynthesis, though. This is the term that is common in the field, wherein you have this molecule and you want to retrofit a pathway, retrosynthesize this from some known molecule. So this is the molecule. This is typically the query. I have X. Can you tell me how I can produce X using whatever? So we simplified the query. We said that given A and B, can you tell if there is a way to convert A to B using extant biochemical knowledge? Our question was, can you build a fully automated engine to predict pathways between a pair of molecules, relying only on structural information? Because if you look at existing databases, they'll give you all kinds of things. They'll say this atom is conserved, so this atom is the same as this atom, and there's some substitution here, something else happens here and all that. So this mechanistic knowledge is not routinely available. And or for example, what is the delta G for this conversion? That may also not be routinely available. You can predict it and so on, but these are not routinely available. So the challenge we took upon ourselves was, could we do this whole business by just relying on structural information, because this is available aplenty. So you have structures of basically all the small molecules are known. Proteins are not known, and well, AlphaFold is completely changing that game. But here we are talking about small molecules, and can we use this information of structural information of small molecules to predict pathways? And now, well, let's dive into the network. So now, from a network of protein-protein interactions that we just saw in the previous part of my talk, a single molecule becomes a graph. And I have one more graph in this very study later in the slide. But a single molecule now becomes a graph. So if you have lactate, every carbon there is a node, and C double bond C is a different kind of C double bond O is a different kind of edge. C double bond C is a different kind of edge. If you had a triple bond, that's a differently labeled edge, and even chiral edges, right? So something that's coming out of the plane of out of the plane and going into the plane and so on. So all of these edges bonds are designated differently. But what we did was, given a reaction, something like A plus B going to C plus D, this is a common biochemical reaction. You have glucose plus ATP giving glucose 6-phosphate plus ADP, reactions like this. We mapped the reactant and product, because in a reaction like this, glucose giving glucose 6-phosphate, the main reactants are glucose and glucose 6-phosphate. ATP, ADP are the helper molecules, so to speak. They're cofactors and so on. But you need to map this. So suppose you're trying to identify what is the transformation happening here. You would be wrong if you said glucose gets converted to ADP. Glucose actually gets converted to glucose 6-phosphate. This sounds simplish, but this has to be done systematically across reactions where we have different kinds of molecules that are involved. So we came with an automated reactant product mapping based on subgraph edit distance. So edit distance is something all of you use every day, whether you know it or not. Edit distance is what runs behind your autocorrect algorithms. Sometimes it may be annoying, but the autocorrect basically works on identifying words that are closest in edits, number of edits, number of typos, to the word that you may have potentially intended to type. That's the same logic we use here. So what is the closest subgraph? So there is some part of the structure, conserved substructure between two molecules, and use this to map reactants and products. And then we say, this is the heart of the action. This is where the action is happening. There is a C double bond O at which all the action happens. This C double bond O is reduced to COH and so on. And then we identify reaction rules that basically compute these deltas. What is the delta change happening in this reaction? And what is the signature that is required for this reaction to happen? Meaning a carbon attached to a doubly bonded carbon with an OH can now be acted upon to get converted to a double bond O. And essentially what we did is, suppose you have a reaction database that says that ethanol can be converted to acetaldehyde and propanol can be converted to propanoic acid. I can now generalize this and say that hexanal, C6 molecule, C6 alcohols, hexanol, can be converted in 2 steps to hexanoic acid. And we do this only based on structure and with a very, very high fidelity and scalability. And we identify reaction rules that capture these transformations. And we now stick these rules into another network, a reaction rule network, where every node is a reaction rule and edges connect rules which can be successively applied on a molecule. So all you have to now do is you take a molecule and sort of run it through this network and see if you get the molecule of interest. And we came up with a nice heuristic that further made this much more effective and so on. And to quickly summarize the study, I don't want to go into much more details in the interest of time. We'll anyway have enough time for discussion. This recovers naturally occurring pathways in many cases, even in central metabolism. Meaning there are so many ways to convert one molecule to another, especially in central metabolism. There are hundreds of routes. But typically we found that the biologically plausible routes were ranked much higher. Meaning the predictions that we make are not only correct in terms of the chemistry and so on, but they're also very biologically plausible. So this helps a realistic ranking of pathways from a potential large pool of alternates. And as I was mentioning in the beginning, we use only structural information, no information of atom-atom mapping, mechanisms, hand-curated rules that talk about when something can happen and when something cannot happen. So obviously we have some approximations and some mistakes. We cannot be as good as the hand-curated ones. But even in terms of hand-curated reactant product mapping, I think we performed with an accuracy of about 93% or so. So this methodology is like really powerful and has a lot of interesting applications. So that completes the next study that I was going to talk to you about. The last study that I want to talk to you about is, I'll keep this a little shorter, hopefully. And here we want to understand network structure. This is very interesting. So can you, just by virtue of the position of a node, talk about its function? In fact, that's the real problem that we started talking about. Whether can we predict protein function based on its network position? It turned out that it was much harder than we anticipated. We settled for predicting protein essentiality. I'll tell you what this is. But in general, there is something known as the centrality lethality hypothesis. So this is very central. It's a very classic study in the field. And in fact, that is the network that you would have seen on my very first slide. It's a classic picture. Maybe I'll go there, but it will take me a little time to come back. But this is the network. So you see that there are some nodes that are colored red, there are some that are colored green. Apologies to those who are red-green colorblind like I am. And there are some that are yellow in color. So what you typically see is the red nodes have much higher degree. So a node that has many neighbors in this network is typically red in color. And this gave rise to what is known as the centrality lethality hypothesis, where the hypothesis basically is the more central a protein is, meaning the more neighbors it has in these kinds of networks, the more likely it is to be essential for cellular function. There are obviously exceptions. For example, if this gene duplicated, the interactions would remain more or less the same, and the duplicate, because there is a duplicate, it's no longer going to be essential. Okay. So what did we do? The question was, can we predict essential genes across organisms? It turns out that this essentiality data is very, very poor. We have essentiality data for about a handful, double-digit organisms. I don't remember the exact number. I think in this study we used around 27, if I remember right. But that is the number of organisms for which we have experimentally determined essentiality data, which become our labels. Okay. But vast number of organisms have genomes and interactomes. Interactomes basically capture all the interactions in an organism. These are available for a large number of organisms. The question we asked was, does protein function, and which we couldn't really fully answer, or essentiality depend on network position? And for essentiality, the answer is a resounding yes. And can we leverage network information to predict essential genes? Very much. And we used a combination of some really interesting features. So it includes those of you who are familiar with network theory, there are measures such as degree, which I was just talking about. Degree is basically number of neighbors of a particular protein. There are other methods such as betweenness centrality or closeness centrality. There are other very interesting measures that a bunch of authors came up with called RefX. So RefX stands for recursive feature extraction. So basically you take a node and take the degree of all its nodes and add it to it. And then you take the degree of all of its nodes and again add a contribution to it and so on. And there are things like page rank as well, which is what Google uses to rank pages and so on. So we took a bunch of these centrality measures. So for every node, you have a long list of centrality measures that you can compute. And now this as the input, are we able to predict the essentiality? We have labeled data. So we finally came up with a bunch of really interesting network features. And most interestingly, we found that even about 12 features can give you very, very high accuracy, like 80% plus and so on. And a lot of current studies have used sequence features. So they take sequences and they'll compute some various physicochemical properties and so on, and use those to predict essentiality and so on. But we wanted to go with networks because network information is now available for a lot of proteins, for a lot of organisms, and we can really leverage it. And this is described in this study and this database. This was very recently accepted for publication in Frontiers in Genetics. And you can check out this database. Sendaman designed it really nicely. A very nice interface and easy to search and download things. And this is very, very useful for biologists because they want to often prioritize what genes are essential, what genes are more important for a particular in a particular organism and things like that. And it will help them design better experiments in the lab. And what we found was just network features can do a great job. You really don't even need to add sequence features. You can do it and get a marginal raise in performance. I think it was something like 85 to 87% or something like that. But with just network features, you get really, really good performance. So now a quick overview of our lab, and with that I will close the talk. So we are an interdisciplinary group. We focus on computational tools and algorithms to understand and manipulate metabolic and biological networks. And three major themes: do a lot of microbiome modeling, a lot of theoretical studies on biological networks, including some very interesting projects with Arun, who just introduced me. We also work with biological data analysis. This is with RBC DSI and so on. And so to look at some of the ongoing projects, you can see that network is a very common theme. So trying to design community metabolic networks for metabolic engineering, trying to understand infant gut microbiota through modeling, or understanding the metabolic underpinnings of various microbiomes, community assembly rules, and so on. So we have some very exciting work that's going on there, where we are looking at microbiomes as diverse as those found on the International Space Station. Yes, surprisingly, we find a lot of microbes on the space station, and also in deep sea hydrothermal vents and so on. We're also tackling network design for synthetic biology from control theory perspectives and so on. And this is again what I was mentioning. We work with Arun. MetQuest is another pure graph theoretic approach that we have developed in our lab to enumerate metabolic pathways in various metabolic networks. And it sort of forms the core for many of these microbiome studies that we have been doing. So with that, let me summarize the three different parts of my talk. There are many applications for graph theory or networks in biology. I hope I've convinced you about that, and it will inspire some of you to go and read a little bit more about this topic. And module identification is a very challenging task. It was also this dream challenge that we participated in, where we had these 6 networks that most of us really struggled with, but finally got some very exciting, interesting results. Because you could not just take the traditional community identification approaches and apply them on these networks. You had to really, really tweak them around. We had multiple approaches to identify core conserved or core tight modules that could give us much better insights, and our results were really good. So some of our results were generated after the challenge. So it was not part of the challenge paper, but it is part of another paper that I did list. Yeah. So with that, I think I would close. So I hope I've shown you 3 different approaches for 3 different ML approaches on various kinds of networks. So for module identification or reaction prediction or essential gene prediction. So with that, I'd like to really acknowledge a lot of students and collaborators who made all this work possible. Beetika and Karthik were central in this module identification project, along with Srini and Ravi as well. Arvind was a really bright CS dual degree student who built this reaction miner tool which uses subgraph mining, and along with Shayan Rano. Himanshu was also part of the disease genes project. And Sendaman is the one who, Sendaman and Ravi and Karthik did some of the basic work for the essential genes prediction, and Sendaman designed the database as well. So with that, I'd really like to thank you all for your attention, and you can stay in touch with me or write to me if you have any queries. And of course, we have, I think, about 18 minutes for questions. So with that, let me stop.
Thank you, Karthik, for that very nice talk. It did cover 3 fundamental problems that one would probably think of using networks. Of course, I have maybe a couple of questions myself, but I'll wait. Let's see if we have any hands raised with regards to questions from the audience.
I see a question on chat, I think.
In the chat window, yeah. So there's one question. Are you able to read it?
Let me open this. I saw it. I saw the pop up. It's. I think it's about why you chose only 1%. Yeah.
Yeah.
So. Yeah. So I think we could really tune it. So we started off with 1%, and we thought because if you start deleting more, what happens is I don't know if 1% is the optimum. We didn't really tune it, I would say. But if you start deleting more, the networks become quite fragmented, and the module's structure is really disrupted. And if you delete say just 0.1% or something like that, then the original network and the new network are too similar to really. So I don't know what the optimum is. It's probably different for different networks, and I think this approach should be tried out on different networks. So we only tried it out on these 6 networks, but it probably should be tried out on more networks to calibrate it and so on. But I think the logic is undeniable, wherein even after some perturbations, if the community structure is still retained, these are going to be like much more closely. Try to open the. Are there any more questions on chat? I don't somehow see.
I don't see any questions on the.
Okay, so I know from the chat. Yeah.
I don't see any.
There are no more questions on chat. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just seeing for any raised hands. If anybody wants to ask a question in voice. Yeah, I think in the meanwhile, let me ask you one question with regards to the learning from networks. I mean, that kind of drove my interest or kind of attracted my attention. from what I understand, you have used a pure, network science-based method rather than using any biology in it. Am I right?
Yes, yes.
Right. So then, two questions, right? One question is, how do you know, or did you know upfront, or what is the kind of faith that you had that a pure network-based method would identify a gene or a set of essential genes that would be biologically consistent?
So the
What kind of
answer to
faith?
that is the centrality lethality hypothesis, right? So there are
Okay.
people who studied these systems already, and as I said in this this picture that you see here, this
Right.
is an experimentally determined protein-protein interaction network in yeast. And
Okay.
they experimentally studied each of these nodes. They removed them one at a time experimentally, and
Wow.
found out if the yeast was dying, meaning it gets a red color, or it was absolutely healthy, which gives it a green color, or if it is a slow grower, it gets an orange color, and I think or yellow, and there's maybe I don't know if there's another color here, which means that they couldn't do the experiment or whatever. But essentially, they found here that uh, proteins that had higher degrees were 3 times as likely to be essential than those with lower degrees. So all these networks are typically power law, and they found that in the tail of the power law, you will obviously find a few high degree nodes, right, which are big hubs and so on. But the majority of these hubs were essential. Whereas you have a lot of these peripheral nodes which have very few edges and so on, and practically very few of them were essential. So this was the first sort of hypothesis. But this hypothesis is it tries to somehow make it very black and white. And
Correct.
I told you an immediate example that if I were to duplicate this gene, you will find that even though the degree is the same, both genes now become non-essential. So the centrality lethality hypothesis has certainly a lot of, it's not entirely correct. There are
Right.
obviously many exceptions to it, and that's what one of the participants is also raising it. It is quite
Right.
debatable. But then if you now add other network measures, like betweenness and a whole lot of these things, and there are also other connectivities. For example, how often what is the connectivity profile of a particular protein? There are so many other things that we looked at. It turns out that, the other paper I didn't talk about, I had mentioned it in passing. We use two methods. There's this recursive feature extraction and Rolex. Rolex was this other method that was based on recursive feature extraction. These are not from our group, but they showed that this kind of methodology was very useful to predict function of different nodes in, I think it was a movie actor network or something like that. So they could find the people who had played particular kinds of roles just by the virtue of the network property and so on. So so the basic hypothesis always is that there is a lot of information. A network has evolved in such a way that it is really connected to its function. So it is not, and I think in biology we typically we agree with that idea, even though something like centrality lethality is an extreme kind of thing, and with a lot of applicability and a few exceptions. But there is generally the notion that the network has enough information about a protein, and we really hope we can actually start predicting function as well. And there's still a few challenges because the function space is much larger.
Right.
The number of classes becomes very large, so training and learning becomes a little more challenging.
Okay. So nice. Now, the second related question is, in this particular problem again, would you have like to use, let us say, some knowledge of the biological functioning? I know that in parts perhaps you have used it, but would the biology of the system be very useful? Could you incorporate it to improve your results, or there's nothing like that?
Sure. The only catch is that in all of if you see the theme in all three topics that I was discussing, we've been very parsimonious in some sense. We're not trying to use much of biological information. The challenge regulation stated that. And similarly, trying to use only structural information, because there is always this notion of what is more widely available and what is harder to get and more expensive to generate and so on. So this becomes the first line. And once you do this prediction, I think biologists can prioritize experiments and do a much better job of whatever they want to do. So this
Yeah,
is
yeah.
where we come
I
from.
agree.
But I think
Yeah.
certainly, if you incorporate biological function information and so on, as we said, just sequence information was able to increase the performance by another 2-3%. But if you can get more solid biological information, I'm sure you can increase the performance a little more. But the only catch is how often do you have such information readily available?
Okay. Well, I still don't see any hands raised. So I'm just going to take the opportunity to ask one more question. Just a bit greedy today. With regards to perturbation, that was interesting. You only perturb the nodes, right? There was no perturbation in terms like the standard perturbation that we use in SysID, where we perturb the inputs and so on. So this is a different kind of perturbation.
So in fact there are three standard methods to perturb, or you can basically bring it down to two. So you take a node and with it you take out all the edges. So that is the classic perturbation that you normally do.
Right.
The other one is the other one is called now becoming a very, very fancy because people do it in experimentally as well. It's called edgetic perturbation. So you basically try to just delete a few edges at random.
Oh, I see. I see.
So this is something that could be done, but we stuck to the simple node perturbation because it's strong, because edgetic is like very a smaller perturbation, and which is why it's very interesting experimentally. But
So I was going to ask that, would there be an experimental equivalent of these perturbations?
Very much, very much. So this very slide that you see is an experimental perturbation analysis, right? So if the color of every node was a result of deleting this node from the network. Okay. Well, really what they did was they didn't delete the node from the network. They removed the protein from the organism. They silenced that gene or something like that. So you no longer have that protein available for that organism's function and things like that. And edgetic perturbations, again, this is very fascinating because it's like literally going on the cell with a scalpel. You have to just go and snap a couple of links in the cell. So this is a lot more tricky, but there's Mark Vidal from, I think, Harvard, who's been doing this very extensively and a lot of interesting results.
So I kind of, because I have some signal processing background, and I'm trying to find the equivalent of some of these operations that you talked about. In signal processing, there is an operation called conditioning. Even in statistics, there is something called conditioning. And one implication of conditioning is, and you can do this numerically. Effectively, here you're doing in a networkically, I can say, but you can do conditioning numerically, where conditioning amounts to holding one or more variables on which you're conditioning fixed, and then examining the effects of other variables. Okay. Of course, you can do this experimentally, but sometimes you may not have the privilege or the opportunity to do this experimentally because you are not the one who is conducting the experiment, let us say. Somebody else is doing the experiment. And during that process, there was all the variables were perhaps excited at some point or the other. And after you collect the data, you do a conditioning where you numerically hold the other variables. I mean, just conceptually, procedurally, this is what equivalent it amounts to. So can I probably say that what you're doing is some kind of by removing certain nodes, can we think of it as some kind of conditioning?
Potentially, but this is somehow feels a little harsher perturbation.
You're cutting off, especially the edge perturbation.
Edge perturbation sounds very much like conditioning. Yes.
Yeah. So it sounds very interesting. I mean, I don't know if people are actually rediscovering some of these in a different terminology and so on. Quite often it happens because of the lack of familiarity with other fields.
Yeah. And when you talk about conditioning, the other thing that really comes to my mind is when we look at metabolic networks, we look at various kinds of perturbations. So in fact, one of the standard perturbations is we try to remove 2 genes at a time.
Right.
So, and we have this very interesting scenario where you remove one of these genes, either of these genes, nothing happens to the system. When you remove the 2 genes, there is a catastrophic effect.
Right.
These two genes are, so, and that you can imagine that here, right? So let's say this duplicated. Now, neither of these are individually essential, neither of these copies, but when you remove both of them, the cell will die because they were together performing an essential function. Okay, I see one more question in the chat.
So how similar would these, maybe they are not similar, but how similar would these be with lasso-like methods which perform variable selection? So you're doing some node selection, right? I know that lasso is applied when you have data and so on. Here, I'm not sure if you have data, you're only given a network structure and edge characteristics.
In fact, now that you raised lasso, we actually have a method that literally does a lasso. So it's called MinReact. It tries to generate the minimum set of reactions that are necessary for an organism to survive. And there are different sets that are possible. So this is a very difficult MILP problem. And because of this, what happens? There are infinitely many solutions. But we had like a very principled method that was biologically motivated that would narrow down on probably the most minimal solution. I mean, there's still no guarantees, but because it's very principled, you get very high quality solutions, high quality minimal solutions.
I would like to take a look at that. Just quickly, because we have about 3 minutes time. There is a question in the chat window that
yes, I think that's a very good question. So let me read the question out. So are there no genes which are essential but do not conform to any of the measures defined to identify essential genes? I think this is a very good question, and this is what we should be looking at more closely. In fact, if you look at the simple centrality lethality hypothesis, such examples are dime a dozen. You'll find that there are many highly, I've seen that even the most connected protein in an organism may often not be lethal. But if you now take the yardsticks that we have developed in terms of our predictions, and for example, where we go wrong, we have an accuracy of 85% or 87%. The 13% where we go wrong, these are genes which are, especially if you look at our false negatives. So they are essential, but they wouldn't basically conform to any of the measures that we have defined to identify essential genes. And I think this has very interesting repercussions. Maybe the network itself is a little faulty because there is always, we are working in the absence of complete information. We are working with partial information. So maybe there is, the network itself has some issues. And or there is genuinely a different, this kind of a rare event or an interesting event that has led to a kind of perturbation and so on. Like a gene duplication or something which really upsets the normal sort of patterns that we look at in a network.
Great.
Thanks for the question too. I think it was quite interesting. Maybe something to really go back and look at for us to understand these networks better.
Okay, great. So I suppose that there are no further questions for now. But participants can always write to the speaker at any point in time. You can always go to the website, get his email address, and write any queries that you have. And of course, also explore. Yeah, so here you go. You have the email address and explore any opportunities at Karthik's lab.
Yeah, sure.
Great. So thank you very much, Karthik. It was a real pleasure to host you.
So let me stop. Stop sharing so that the next speaker can.
Yeah. So we have. So once again, on behalf of the organizers, we would like to thank you, Karthik. Here we have a virtual memento for you. Think of it that we will send you by email.
Thank you
very much.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah. So
you need to stop the recording.
Yeah, I do that.